So for the past year or so, I've been making videos for the fine folks at Dialtune, and one of the video series we put out is called Get That Sound. And the point was to try and replicate famous recorded drum sounds as closely as possible. Now, this video is not at all about Dialtune. It's about what I learned in creating that series and what actually ended up being the most important factors in trying to get all of these very, very different recorded drum sounds. And I discovered that there are roughly 4 different things that made the biggest difference in being able to, I was actually very pleasantly surprised at how closely I was able to get these sounds. So anyways, what I'm going to do before I go any further is I'm just going to roll those clips of the different tones that I got from the same drum, same room, same microphone setup, and all these very different drum tones I was able to replicate. And I'm gonna let you listen to them and then see if the information in this video will be relevant to you. So I'll roll those clips and then we'll go into a full breakdown of the 4 things that I found to be most important in being able to replicate those sounds. So here they are. So, like I said, I was actually really pleasantly surprised at how closely I was able to match those sounds. They're not perfect by any means, but like I said, I was using the exact same snare in all of those, same microphone setup, same room, and of course I'm not the original drummer on those recordings, which brings me to my next point, my sort of disclaimer I need to put out there, that I want to head off any sort of comments that are like, yeah, but you know, you didn't talk about preamps, and yeah, you didn't talk about like the studio that you were in, and that's the point here. There are certain things that I'm not going to talk about, and that is the whole point, is that I'm going to talk about 4 things that I found to be the most important. And of course, I could have gotten the same preamps that Chad Smith used, and you know, of course, I could get Chad Smith in. I mean, I couldn't actually get Chad Smith in to play on a record, but the point is that if someone was trying to recreate a sound, they could get Chad Smith in, they could use the exact drum that he used, but then you are literally recreating that sound. We are talking about being able to emulate a sound with the gear that you already have. So I'm going to leave a lot of stuff out, and I'm going to talk about the 4 things that I found to be most important. 2 of them are in the recording process in this room, and then 2 of them are in the mix. The mix, of course, is very, very important in getting a certain drum tone. So we'll start in here, and then we'll move to the computer when it comes time to mix. Now, the other thing I should mention is that I have a fair amount of gear here, and a fair amount of it is fairly expensive, but I just want to put out there that I really think that you can replicate almost all of what I'm doing with much less expensive gear, and hopefully in the way I explain these techniques, it's not meant to sound like, oh, you need this expensive microphone, or you need these expensive drums to get this sound. I am going to assume that you have microphones, preferably multiple microphones, that you've got a drum set, a room to record in, and then most importantly, you need to have a reference. You need to have the drum track that you are trying to emulate. It doesn't need to be one of the ones that I did. It can be any snare sound or any drum sound that you like, but you need to have a target that you're actually chasing, something to try and get your sound closer to. So I'm going to assume that you have all of those things here before diving in. So before I get into the first step in replicating the sound, I'm going to just talk about the recording setup I have going on here really quickly. And yes, I'm gonna put markers in there so that you can scrub ahead if you want to skip all of this. But for those that are interested, the situation I've got going in here is a medium-sized room. I have a fair amount of dampening in here, so it's a fairly dry sounding room. And I have a lot of microphones set up and I'm not necessarily using all of them at once. So I've got 2 room mics, I've got the Coles 4038s, I've got 3 bass drum mics, I've got a sub kick, a kick out and a kick in, I've got snare top and bottom, I've got close mics on the toms, although I'm not even using the toms in this recording. I've got 3 overheads so that I can just use a mono single overhead, or I can use just stereo, or I can use all 3 at the same time. I've got a hi-hat mic going. So there's a fair amount of options here as far as microphones go, but you'll see when we get into the mix process that I don't actually use all of them all the time. So you wouldn't necessarily need to have every single one of these microphones depending on what sound you're going for. The last piece of gear that's probably relevant here is the fact that I was using the Dialtune snare the whole time, which you definitely don't need the Dialtune to take these ideas and use them yourself. But it did make it easier for me because I was able to very, very quickly adjust the relationship between the top and bottom heads. And then I was also able to swap out heads, although I think I pretty much used an ambassador the whole time, but I was able to try out different heads very, very quickly as well. So there was definitely a benefit to using the Dialtune, but in no way am I saying you need a Dialtune snare to take these tips and roll with them. All right, so finally, with all of that out of the way, let's talk about the first most important thing that I found in replicating a sound, and it is, hopefully no surprise to anyone, that it's tuning. Before you put up any mics or start recording or start playing or practicing, tuning the drum to your reference track, again, hopefully you have a reference track, something that you're going for, is supremely important. You cannot get the sound from vultures with a high-tuned snare. It is the first step in trying to replicate a sound, and it probably seems obvious, but sometimes it isn't for folks. So the basic things that I'm thinking about, the top head is the most important. In my view, just getting relative pitch to whatever your reference track sounds like. And what I would do is I would have my reference track going in one ear, and if you can find an isolated drum track from the performance, which you can a lot of the time these days, that is really, really helpful. Have the reference track in one ear and then be tuning with the other ear free. And so what I would do is I would tune the top head first, just for pitch, what I was hearing close to the reference track, and then I would tune the bottom head based on whatever overtones I was hearing. And sometimes you really need some nice headphones or in-ears to hear this sort of thing, and it's a lot easier if you have the isolated track. But if you can hear, it's hard to describe almost, but like what the decay of the drum and the overtones sound like, you can sometimes detect what pitch the bottom head was at. So that's also something I would do, is I would do the top head first, and then if I couldn't really tell with the bottom head, I would just crank it tight. And if it sounded like maybe there was a little bit of overtone coming from the bottom head, I would bring it down to whatever that pitch was. The other thing you want to bear in mind too is how tight are the snare wires. So for something like vultures, you want them shockingly loose. And then for something like, I don't know, Give It Away, you want them relatively tighter. So once you have the drum set up and tuned correctly, the second thing that is of paramount importance is the performance. So actually playing the part like the drummer that you are trying to emulate. So trying to get in the head of the original drummer and play like that. And you should be thinking more broadly than just what notes did they play, whatever the part is. You might say, well, yeah, on paper, of course, I can play that groove that I'm trying to emulate, but you really want to think deeper and think, okay, you know, what size of sticks does it seem like they're using? Is this a fat, chunky sound, or is this a lighter touch sort of sound? Am I emulating Questlove? Am I emulating Chad Smith? And playing appropriately. Are there big fat rim shots being played? Does it sound like maybe they're playing out towards the edge of the snare? All of those things you want to think about. And then the blend with the rest of the kit too. How loud is the kick and how loud is the hi-hat in comparison to the snare? And this is just good advice for all of us when we're playing anything, is trying to think of those relative balances. But in this case, it is especially true where if you get all your other components dialed in and sounding right, but then you are playing in a way that is very, very different from the original source material, it's never going to sound right. So tuning and then your performance are the two most important things to dial in the actual recording process. Now we're going to move over to the computer here in just a second, and I'm going to assume that you will have done a recording. Now we talked a little bit earlier about microphones, and my advice is to, if you know what you're going for and you know that you're going to go for a roomier sound or more of a close sound, use whatever microphones you have. Microphone choice and microphone placement, believe it or not actually as important in my personal opinion. Now, it's easy for me to say because I have a lot of different microphones set up in different places and they're fairly nice microphones. So I understand that it might sound a little patronizing if I say, yeah, the microphone placement and microphone choice is not as important. But I really do believe that that's the case. I think you could use a wide variety of different microphones and just use general use placements. I'm not doing anything crazy here. I've got a stereo overhead pair and my room mics are, however far back from the kit. I'm really not reinventing the wheel in any way here. So just try and get some ambient mics if you can and some close mics on the kit. I will assume that you have done that, gotten a recording where your drums are tuned correctly and you have performed as best as you can like the original source material. And then, this is also very important, we're going to move to the computer now. Okay, so here we are at the computer. We are looking at the session for Give It Away, Red Hot Chili Peppers. That's what I was emulating here. And it cannot be understated how important this part of the process is. And let me illustrate that here. So here's the dry mix. Here's just what the microphones were picking up. Okay, and then here, give me just a sec. Here is after all the plugins are engaged. Kind of aggressive processing, I know, but that's sort of the style there. That's what we were going for. So huge difference. And like I said, there are two other elements that I want you to focus on in particular. And they're both mix related, but the first one is the balance between your ambient and your close mics. Is this going to be more of an ambient mic recording or is this going to be more of a close mic recording? So do you want to hear more room sound? Do you want it to sound bigger and more open, like a Zeppelin sort of thing? Or do you want it to be very tight and focused and punchy, more like a, I don't know, like a Queens of the Stone Age sort of thing? The more you listen to these reference tracks and the more you record, the more you'll sort of be able to pick out the difference between like a punchy, very immediate close mic sound and a more ambient room mic sound. So let me just show you kind of what I'm talking about here. In this case, here's just the kick and snare. Okay, and then here are here's the room. And you'll see I didn't even use the overheads. Here's what the overheads sounded like. I didn't even need them because what I wanted was, Give It Away in particular, is definitely more of a blend between the close mics and the room mics, but I really wanted to get that punch from the close mic. So even just with kick and snare, you're getting most of the effect. Okay, so that's the third element there, is the blend between ambient mics and close mics. That makes a huge difference. And actually, just to illustrate that, let me de-emphasize the close mics and I'll push in the ambient mics here and you'll hear how different it sounds. So if I go, let me add in the overheads and the room and push those up. So that's the same mix, but with the ambient mics emphasized and the close mics de-emphasized. So you might actually like that sound better, but I don't think that that is closer to what Give It Away actually sounds like. So anyways, the fourth element here, the final element, is a little more abstract, and it is the mix in general. And when I say the mix, I'm primarily talking about EQ and compression. And with EQ and compression, really just thinking along two axes. With EQ, thinking, do I need this to be overall brighter or darker? Something like Funky Drummer was very much a darker recording, whereas something like Give It Away is way brighter, much brighter than I would normally mix a drum recording. But that's kind of what it sounds like on the album. That's part of the effect. So you'll see, like if I open up the snare here, I'm boosting a bunch of 8K here. I'm adding in a lot of top end. I think I'm doing the same thing elsewhere as well. I'm adding a lot of like click and a lot of high-end energy there. So you want to know overall when you're EQing the close mics and the room mics and the ambient mics, am I going for overall a brighter sound or a darker sound? And you have to listen to your reference track. You need to go back and forth between your mix and the reference track to really try and hone in on that. And then the two axes for compression would basically be, do you want it to be, and I don't want this to turn into a complete compression lesson, but do you want it to be a more transparent compression where it's just kind of tucking everything in, or do you want this to be smashier? With this, and when I say smashy, I mean like fast attack, fast release, right? That's what I've got going on. That's what I've got going on here. That's without this compression. Actually, that's not a super fast attack, to be honest, but I also have smack attack here, which is adding some of that back. So anyways, let's not get bogged down in that. Very fast release. You want the character of your compression to fit what the vibe of the track is going to be. And you also need to decide, am I doing more compression on the ambient mics? Again, this goes back to your choice whether to use more ambient recording or more close mic recording, and how do you compress each one. So again, you can also hear on the room mic, we've got some compression on there as well, which really makes a difference. Let me flip it on and off. There's just a lot more like life and energy, I guess, which seems sort of counterintuitive, but that's sort of what you get when you add compression like this. So you'll also notice that there are some other effects on these. Personally, I tend not to add fake reverb when I'm mixing most of the time, but that is what I felt like this track needed. I felt like the kick and the snare both needed some reverb on them, so that makes a huge difference as well. I just wanted to get, it's almost like I was using close mics to get more of an ambient mic sound, if that makes any sense. So I can't give you an exact recipe because, of course, every track is going to be completely different. And if I opened up another session, it would look entirely different than this one. But bear in mind that I used the same drum, the same mics, the same room for all of those different sounds. And I was really, in broad strokes, when it comes to the mix, thinking of, again, the balance between the ambient and the close mics, what I was going to use, and then mix decisions. It's really like EQ, compression. EQ, brighter or darker. Compression, more or less, and smashier, if that's a term, or less smashy. So anyways, let's take it back to the studio and we'll just recap everything real quick. All right, there we go. So just to recap really quickly, the 4 things that were most important for me when trying to replicate these sounds was 1, making sure that the drum itself was tuned very precisely and tuned very closely with the reference track. 2, making sure that my performance was as close as I could get it to the source material. 3, in the mix stage, deciding how much ambient mic you're going to use and how much of the close mics you're going to use, and that kind of bleeds into the recording stage too, depending on how many mics you have to use. And then 4, deciding how much EQ and compression are you using, and with EQ, are you going for an overall brighter sound, a darker sound? Then with compression, are you going to smash it? Are you going to use more compression on the close mics? Are you going to use more on the room mics, because they'll have very different effects? Now, like I said earlier, there are many things that I didn't mention that definitely have an impact on the drum sound. Having a different room to use, having a different drummer to use, having different preamps, all of these things are, yes, important and influence the sound, but the point is that it was these 4 things that I found made up 90% of the difference in trying to get all of these different tones with the Dialtune snare. So, let me know if these are helpful for you at all. Hopefully you got something out of this. Thank you for watching, and if there are any sounds that you'd like to see me replicate for Dialtune's channel, then let me know in the comments. So again, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.